Hey, it's Alabama Annie, and welcome to part 27 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Life slowly returned to normal as summer ended and school began again, but that year, every time I looked at Willie's desk, I felt sad. Still, Halloween arrived, and for a while, we all had some fun. I came up with an idea that Lenny and I should dress as Raggedy Ann and Andy, and he agreed. So, in the evenings after school, we worked on our costumes with Miss Hattie's help. We made them out of an old red Christmas tablecloth and some red yarn and a big old black piece of curtain that we'd found in the closet. We made me a black skirt and him some loose short pants. We sewed them all together. We sewed white caps made out of pillowcases for our heads to put the yarn on. In fact, we looked so good that year that we won the costume contest at the school carnival. Then Thanksgiving came in unseasonably warm and rainy. The Jacksons and all of our regulars joined us for dinner that year, including Aldous, who contributed to the feast by bringing a dressed wild turkey. And before I knew it, Thanksgiving was over, and Uncle John and Lenny were going out to find us a cedar tree for Christmas. They brought in the biggest one they could find, and it smelled wonderful. We went shopping for gifts, but this year we shopped in Sequoia at the Five and Dime, and of course we took part in the Christmas pageant at school. That year, it was a short play written by our teacher, Mr. Timmons, and it was very funny. The play was about an elf who was afraid of toys until he met Santa, and all of us kids from school got to be a part of it, dressed as dolls and stuffed animals, and wooden soldiers, and of course elves, and it was good to laugh again. Lenny was a wooden soldier, and I was a teddy bear. But this time our costumes weren't homemade. They came from the local theater in a nearby town that had closed, and the owner of the theater had donated them to the church and the school for future events. It seemed, though, no one was laughing enough those days with all the bad news on the radio and the events of the past year around home. But that Sunday night, folks in the pews at the church laughed hard, even harder than when the Reverend tried to tell one of his preacher jokes. Now, we had very few guests at the tavern that year, once summer was over and the camps had closed for the season, except for a few stragglers. Money was tight. But I had a big surprise on Christmas Eve morning. I got up to see Miss Martha in the kitchen with the bells. I rushed over to her and gave her a big hug as she commented on how much I'd grown. I was almost as tall as she was. I sat between Miss Hattie and Martha at breakfast. It was the best present ever. And on Christmas Day that year, it was just Miss Martha, Lenny, and myself, Aunt Mary, Mr. Harry from the hotel, Aldous Wells, William Post, and Leonard at the table for dinner. Miss Hattie, Harvey, and Uncle John had gone over to Hattie's sister's for the day, and it would be one of the few times they hadn't been home for Christmas. Lenny got a book on fossils, a baseball, and some all-weather boots. He gave me a little tabletop radio to sit on my bedside table, and I also got new pajamas from Miss Martha and those binoculars I'd been wanting from Aunt Mary, and they all liked the presents. I'd bought them at the Five and Dime, and everyone seemed jolly enough, but no matter how I tried to overlook it, there was something in the air, and none of us were in the best of spirits. Aunt Mary wasn't her jovial self. For one thing, she didn't have a boyfriend, and the rest of the hats had gone off to the beach for the holidays and left her behind. At the table, Mr. Harry talked about how hard it had been the last few months just to make ends meet at the old hotel. He said he'd closed off the upstairs rooms for the winter to save money, and he'd only had 3 customers all week. And he said business at the restaurant was way down as well. And he was talking about having to even let go some of his staff. I really wondered what they would do without work. I knew Aunt Mary had been struggling too to keep the electricity on, and I knew Uncle John had traded a hog for a load of coal not long before, and Hattie had been selling all the spare eggs the hens could lay to the store, or trading them for homemade preserves, butter, or honey with the neighbors. And Lenny said his dad had taken some chickens and a goat as payment for Miss Leah Hart's funeral and burial just after Thanksgiving. Around the table, there was talk about ways to cut corners and save money, and it concerned me because I really didn't know what I could do to help. But at night, we no longer left the lights on in the parlor or any of the upstairs rooms. We only left the porch on in case someone came by for a room, but we didn't have many guests at all. Miss Hattie had cut back on keeping the pantry stocked as well, using up what she had rather than buying more. She'd started baking our bread, which was delicious, but we made fewer cakes and pies to save on the sugar and the eggs. And Aunt Mary wasn't going on any of her shopping sprees or ordering new clothes from her catalogs right then, and it had been late fall since she'd bought me a new dress, and lately people had been stealing things around Starlight. There was a thief among us. Mr. Harvey had heard Lem Foster discovered 2 of his baby pigs missing from their pen, and someone had even stolen canned goods from the pantry at the community house. And that was just plain silly. All they had to do was ask. Harry also said $15 had come up missing from the Christmas fund at the County Line store. And for the first time since I'd been at the tavern, we were locking our doors at night so some straggler wouldn't just wander in from the road and take something. One morning just before Thanksgiving, Mr. Harvey had found a hobo sleeping on the porch swing of the tavern, so we invited him in for breakfast and then sent him on his way. In fact, Uncle John drove him all the way down to Sequoia to make sure he didn't hang around. Leonard said you couldn't be too careful those days. He said people did things they normally wouldn't do in hard times like those just to get by. On New Year's Eve, we rang in 1935 on the front porch of the tavern with firecrackers and some sparklers. There was no big party at the hotel that year, and it sat across the way in almost total darkness. But the tavern was full of friends. People rang handbells and shot guns into the air and honked their car horns at the stroke of midnight, and the next day, to ensure our prosperity, Hattie prepared a traditional New Year's Day meal of turnip greens, black-eyed peas, and a little ham, and Aldous joined us for dinner. I ate as much as I could. I was saving a little space, though, for the pecan pie Mr. Harry had baked. After dinner, as usual, Lenny asked Aldous to tell us a story before bedtime. He asked for a scary one, and he told us a tale I will never forget. It was one of the many stories about the little people neither Lenny nor I had ever heard before. We all settled in front of the fire as he began the story. Rudy Stokes had been in trouble most of his life for one thing or another, mostly petty crimes that landed him in the pokey from time to time. But when he stole a car from a visitor to the mountain and crashed it into the side of Clara Lee's house early one morning because he didn't know how to drive, he'd found himself standing before Judge Ramey once again, a man who was tired of seeing him every couple of months for petty crimes. Judge Ramey sentenced Rudy to 1 year hard labor on the chain gang and sent him off to the pokey. The convicts were roused early each morning and sent off to work one place or the other to sling blade weeds or clear for the county. That day, they sent them all down across the mountain to a place called Shinbone Ridge, and set them to clearing brush and cutting trees for a new leg of the Tag Railroad that would run from Tennessee into Georgia and on into Alabama. After days and days of working in the hot summer sun, bitten from head to toe by mosquitoes and covered in a rash from poison oak, Rudy made up his mind he was going to leave. He crept off from the work camp one windy night in his worn-out boots, his dungarees, and his striped prison shirt, while the two deputies sat beside the fire arguing about the weather and who would do the midnight bed check. Rudy lit out through the woods along the roadbed, following a trail that took him off east away from the work camp. He was headed toward Dogtown, and he'd gone a good distance when he came up on a small farm. There were clothes hanging on the clothesline, so Rudy ran into the yard and snatched a shirt and some socks. In a pine thicket, he shed the convict shirt and put on the plaid one. He buried the convict shirt in some pine straw best he could, and he went on. He kept thinking if he could make Dogtown by morning, pretty little Millie DuPont would surely take him in and feed him some of her fine biscuits and gravy. The wind had died down and the moon was high as clouds drifted over. It lit the forest so Rudy could see his way very clear among the rocks and the trees, and he was making good time and thought he knew his way across the top of the mountain. But the trail took him into a hollow he wasn't familiar with. The moon didn't reach through the thick canopy of trees as he descended down among rocks and fallen limbs, but he could hear a creek running and headed toward that sound. He stood looking for a place to cross the creek when he came to its edge. He could see the moon again, and its light danced off the water. The water was fast, and it looked deep. He looked left. Huge boulders blocked his path. He looked downstream and saw what appeared to be a trail of sorts that rounded a bend. Best to follow the water, he thought to himself, taking that trail as it descended again. At least he was able to see his way along. But then the wind began to blow and dark clouds obscured the light. He was moving between very tall cliffs. In near darkness, he carefully moved on but slid on some loose rock. Rudy gasped to see he was only inches away from a sheer drop down to the water. He scampered backwards away from the edge of the precipice, but his foot slipped again and Rudy screamed. Rudy awoke on the banks of the river beside a large boulder on a sandbar. There was sand in his mouth and his eyes, and he could taste blood from a busted lip. He was afraid to move. It felt as though every bone in his body might be broken, and he thought to himself, if I don't get out of here, no one will ever find me. Then Rudy must have fallen asleep. When he awoke, he jerked awake and into a sitting position and tried to wipe the sand from his eyes. His ears were ringing and he felt really dizzy, but at least he could see. The moon was out again. He got up the nerve to try and move. First his arms. His left shoulder ached badly. He looked at his legs. He moved one and then the other, but a sharp pain shot through the right one, and he knew something had to be broken or badly sprained. I got to get out of here, Rudy said aloud, looking around for anything he could grab to pull himself up. He spied a sturdy tree branch to his left. He leaned in and reached for it, grabbing hold of the branch. He pulled it to him. Then with much crying and grunting, Rudy managed to get himself into a crouching position, half standing, half kneeling, shaky and unsteady as he leaned on that branch for support. After a moment, he began to move slowly along the edge of the river again. He paused to rest before crossing a flat stone at the water's edge when a high-pitched scream split the night. It came from somewhere behind him, and it made his heart skip a beat. His hair stood on end. Rudy froze, clinging to the stick for balance, as he craned his neck to see what was behind him or what was in front of him. He told himself it had to be a screech owl, but he'd never heard one sound like that. Chicken, he said to himself, moving a few more steps, gaining his confidence again that he could get himself out of this mess. But then the sound came again, only this time it was very close. As he stumbled and halted in his tracks, a third scream, even shriller than the other two, came from just ahead of him. He jerked his head from side to side, looking this way and that, trying to figure out how to get out of this mess, when he saw them. 3 fast-moving little figures, no taller than small children, rushed toward him. "Get away from me," he cried as they surrounded him, talking in gibberish he could not understand and growling. That sent a chill to his very bones. One of them snatched his stick away with a long bony hand, while another one shoved him down onto the sand, and the third screeched again, its little face only inches from his, its mouth wide to reveal a row of white, uneven teeth. Aldous exclaimed as he leaned forward and continued the story. Rudy heard himself scream then, although it seemed to be a sound that had come from somewhere else. He didn't believe he could scream like a girl. He closed his eyes, hoping he'd open them again to find he had been dreaming and that he was in the convict camp tent in his own bed. But when he opened his eyes again, the creatures were still there. They dragged him, tugging him by his dungarees, ripping off his shirt. The sand and the rocks scratched his belly and his back as they carried him along. They growled and grunted, the nasty little people, hauling him off the trail through a narrow passage in the cliff face. They tugged him upward and over the jagged edge as he screamed again. His head bumped a rock here and a tree there. His injured leg dangled at awkward angles. Briars ripped his skin and tangled in his hair as they dragged him through the bushes and the brambles into a small clearing. Then Rudy found himself beside a fire, lying on a bare piece of ground. A snarling sound caused him to turn his head. Now there were several more of them, ripping apart the charred remains of what appeared to be a rabbit or a squirrel with their jagged teeth. One of them tried to shove a piece of that bloody meat into his own mouth as Rudy coughed and gagged and turned his head away. He fell unconscious again. Rudy awoke at dawn in the clearing where the fire had been. As he came to himself and looked around, he saw that he was naked. He saw the ground around him was littered with bones and other bloody things he could not identify, and the smell was horrendous. But the nasty little creatures that had dragged him there were gone. Relieved that they were gone, Rudy began to cry like a baby when he heard the distant sound of dogs baying. Their baying was like music to his ears as the search party came closer through the forest. He struggled to raise himself up on a raw elbow and cried, "Here, boss! Here! I'm over here!" until the sheriff and his men came into the clearing, sidestepping the bloody remains of animals and bones to reach him. Rudy could not stand or walk on his own, and he wasn't making any sense when the men carried him out on a makeshift litter covered in a blanket. He awoke several days later in the county infirmary, just grateful to be alive and safe. His broken hip and shoulder were mending. When the sheriff asked him what had happened, Rudy was afraid to tell him the truth. He didn't think anyone would believe he had been attacked by a group of flesh-eating little people. Each night when he tried to sleep, he had nightmares about the ugly little creatures tugging and pulling on him, and he'd awake screaming in the ward. But finally, though, when the doctor said Rudy could be released from the infirmary, the sheriff came to take him back to the jail. On the short ride there, the sheriff said, "You know you're lucky. You got out of there with your life. Ain't nobody much ever comes back from Little Man Holler." Rudy Stokes ventured outside the walls of the building, afraid to be in the forest or even on the lawn outside the jail. He was afraid of the night and afraid he might see them again. So he rarely went further than the gate around the building. But once, when a circus came to the valley, Rudy thought he might enjoy it when the sheriff asked if they all wanted to go and see the show. He agreed and went with them. But there were little people in the circus, and they terrified him. After another short visit to the hospital to recover from that shock, Rudy became a trustee of the jail and lived out his days within its confines. He rarely even ventured outdoors. As Aldous concluded his story, I thought about the little person I had seen in the rocks along the brow one night when I was younger, and I had a strange dream about Rudy and those little people with their sharp, pointy teeth and their bony little fingers.